Hello, everybody. It's great to be here with you. My name is Raymond Chang, and I am the president of the Asian American Christian Collaborative. I'm really excited about this discussion that we're about to have with Jonathan Tran and Isaiah Jeong, Dr. Jonathan Tran, who teaches at Baylor University in the philosophy department. He just wrote a book on Asian American Christianity and racial capitalism and the spirit of racial capitalism, and he really unpacks a lot of what Asian American Christians and Asian Americans more broadly really need to be thinking through as we navigate our life and our faith in this world and in the society that we live in. He probably is going to This book is probably going to be one of the most consequential books for Asian Americans and Asian American Christians to consider. And I say that it's a book that you need to be reading in tandem with and in conjunction with the Christian Imagination by Willie Jennings. They're actually very good partners in discourse. But I'm excited to have this discussion so that you can understand kind of a book that's just being released into the world, so for your own consideration and to kind of process through some of the nuances and the complexities of the state that we are in when it comes to when it comes to being Asian American, and how we need to unpack everything from kind of our racial identity or what it means to be Asian American, and the category of Asian American as a whole, to kind of the material effects or the real life effects um, of racialization and racism upon our communities, and how that affects other communities around us and other people around us. And so, before we continue on, I want to introduce everybody. Maybe each of you can give a little bit about your background and tell a little bit about yourselves before we get into the discussion. Can we start with you, Dr. Tran?
Thanks, Ray, for having me on, and thanks for the work of the collaborative and for many friends and communities associated with your group. So my name is Jonathan Tran. I teach theology and ethics at Baylor. As Ray said, I've been there for 15 years. I'm from Southern California. Like I think a lot of people from the collaborative have connections to Southern California because so much of Asian American history kind of passed through California, the North and the South. So a little bit of background. I'm a immigrant to America. I came in 1975 at the end of the Vietnam War, when when the war ended, the United States allowed a kind of emergency act through the U.S. Congress for about 10,000 Friends of America to come to America because of the situation with the communists in South and North Vietnam. So our family came. They were expecting 10,000, and they got about 120, 30,000 people in just a short few weeks. And then that would be added by tens of thousands of folks over the next decade from Vietnam. So our family came, we were poor, we were war refugees. You coming to America to go to, some elite university to get a degree in electrical engineering is a very different context than coming to America as a war refugee. Our family never wanted to come to America. That wasn't part of how they imagined their futures. And they certainly didn't know very much about the place they were going. So we came in 75, we were poor, and we made our way through. One of the significant factors in our migration was the US government allied with a number of large church denominations, Roman Catholics, Protestant denominations like the Presbyterians, the Lutherans, and they adopted our family, out of the refugee camps, and they acclimated us to America. So while we weren't Christians, and I don't think anyone really became a Christian through that experience, the church played a profound role in my family's life from early on. And so its generosity and kindness was an indelible image of my youth. So in some ways, my book, the book that's coming out, is the attempt to make sense of our life in America, our life as Vietnamese Americans, and then the life of Vietnamese Americans and Asian Americans across the spans of what that means at this moment. I think we live in a really interesting moment in American history where we are thankfully increasingly aware of our past and what we have done, especially the forms of violence that have been enacted for America to be America, and the deep complicity of the American church in that, especially in the context of racism. So how do we contend and come to terms with that past, while also kind of eking out a future for ourselves, for our families, our communities, but also with others? I think these are difficult and amazing questions in front of us.
We're looking forward to diving into that, both in this conversation and especially as you dive into it in the book. Isaiah, do you want to introduce yourself a little bit?
Yeah, thanks for having me here, Ray, and good to be here with you, Jonathan. My name is Isaiah Jeong, and I'm originally from Seattle, but I moved to the cold Chicagoland about 10 years ago, where I graduated from Wheaton College, and that's where I met Ray. And throughout some course of a lot of winding, I went to seminary, and now I am at University of Illinois, Chicago, studying sociology. Right now, I'm studying I'm gathering data for anti-Asian hate, and my dissertation will take the religion and race trajectory. And I've gotten to know Jonathan the past several years through my brother, who was down at Baylor, and we have become just great friends, and he's been a great mentor. So, and I've also engaged deeply with the book. I had a privilege of reading the earlier manuscripts and thinking through some of the parts with Jonathan. So I thought this would be a really dynamic conversation as someone who already read the book. So I'm really looking forward to the discussion, and thanks for having me here.
Yeah, no, it's great to have you here, especially as you're kind of on the younger end of the millennial category. I was hoping that you were Gen Z, because then we could have a Gen Zer be reading with us. But to be able to kind of speak into this, especially as I think that the dialogue around race has become far more nuanced and complex over time in a good way. Like, I think that there's more being revealed in terms of the limitations of kind of the racial language and the racial categorizations that we currently see. But Jonathan, could you give us like a brief overview of your book? What could people be looking for, and what could people be expecting as they read the book? And why did you write the book?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the book actually started as, a kind of rather routine academic assignment. Some press wanted me to take standard anti-racism stuff and maybe expand it out a little bit and talk about how Asian Americans are part of the anti-racism story. And so I began writing that book, and then I realized we simply don't fit that story. And I try to do, I think, what a lot of scholars have tried to do is make us fit in, or make us squeeze us in on the margins. But the more I looked at the anti-racism literature, and the more I thought about the experience of Asian Americans, I thought there was something odd or challenging simply about Asian Americans, that they somehow fractured the larger narrative, that they pushed the bounds of what counts as anti-racism. And the way I saw this was that, the thing about anti-racism in America, which is almost entirely a black and white discourse, or a white and black discourse, a white and black conversation, is that it marginalized those already marginalized by racism. And I wanted to know why. Instead of trying to fit us back in as if, we're the problem, I wanted to know what the problems with the conversation were, that we were marginalized. Why, whenever issues of race come up, Asian Americans rarely, if ever, come on the scene as part of the conversation. I mean, probably before last spring, if you asked most Americans whether Asian Americans experience racism, the answer wouldn't simply be a no. It would be like a shrug. It's like we don't even register as people of color, or if we do, we're seen with suspicion, as if, in the language of one person, we're cozying up to whiteness, or we're white proximate or something like this. And I thought, well, that description is it can be accurate in some cases. It doesn't quite come to terms with very much about Asian America, or the experience of many, many Asian Americans. And so I wanted to know why we had come to a place like this in our anti-racism. The Asian Americans simply don't fit. And so the book began there, and then just kept on going. And it was the attempt to follow the rabbit hole all the way down. And so the book describes a reality in which Asian American racial identity comes to develop in a very particular context around issues of white and Black racial identities. And the way that what racial identity is in our country is a way to pit people against each other. Part of what the book is trying to do is ask a very difficult question, a painful question, is whether continuing to talk in terms of race is going to help us, or whether it's going to simply reinforce the same forms of oppression and domination that have constituted the life of this country since the beginning.
Yeah, I mean that's a lot, even in that, and that's a huge endeavor, which I think you tackle in the book, especially through two kind of significant case studies. But even your experience and your kind of background, does challenge the some of the stereotypes and some of the prejudices that exist. And I wonder how much your own kind of position and your own background, your own positionality affects how you understand kind of the categorizations, and I guess maybe a question would be like, where do you see some of the strengths of the discourse currently, and then where do you see the gaps, without giving everything in your book away?
I'm happy to give away as much as your readers will take. The book, I would love for people to read the book, of course, but really the book is just mine, and there's other people like you, of course, Ray, have been doing this for the last few years. It's the attempt to initiate a new conversation, or at least open up new ways into the current conversation. The current conversation, to my mind, as I describe it in the book, is overly interested in questions of racial identity. It's fixated on racial identity as the story of racism in America. And so the story goes like this. White people, as white people, are bad. We know this because they enact all forms of racism at the structural, systemic, and personal level. That's obviously true in some significant measure. And what they do is enact that against people of color. That's the dominant story of racism. The anti-racism story then is to bring down white people and to elevate people of color. I think that's generally how our anti-racism goes. It's a story about racial identities and the moralization of racial identities, or the ascribing of moral worth to certain racial identities. My question is whether that really does much other than flip the script of the previous form of why race was created. What I try to do is step back and ask, why do we come up with the idea of racial identities? Like, what is race? Like, why did that become a chief organizing category, right? If you go elsewhere in the world, race is a significant way of identifying people, but it's one way of identifying people among all kinds of ways, right? In other parts of the world, language, history, experience, family, geography, culture, ethnicity, all play roles. Why is race such an incredibly powerful thing in America? And so what I do is I try to peel back the layers on this and tell the story of how race was created to identify people as forms of property and labor, and how an entire society was organized around valuing and devaluing certain human beings, creating systems of extraordinary and obvious inequality, and using race as a stamp on top of it to justify it, right? It goes like this. I drive around my city, right, which is Waco, or you all drive around parts of Chicago, and I get to a part of the city that's especially dilapidated. They have minimal access to healthcare. The housing is breaking down. There's no infrastructural investment on the part of the city or the county or the state. People have minimal ability to have decent educations for their children. And then someone asks a question like, why is this? This is so obviously wrong. It's so obviously unjust. And the answer comes back something like, well, it's because they're brown people. Instead of asking the question of why have we created a society of such extraordinary inequality, we blame it on them, right? It's the ultimate form of gaslighting. We say it's something about you, brown people, something about your nature, something about your bodies, something about your history, something about your identity. That to me is what race is. Race is a form of justification we create as societies and as individuals to justify what are obviously systems that need to be rethought and likely dismantled. Instead of rethinking and dismantling, instead of questioning the world we've created, we blame the victims. That to me is what racism is. In the history of the Black radical tradition, this description has been called racial capitalism. That's just a fancy title. It's obviously part of the fancy title of my mouthful of a book title of my book. But really, it's the basic practice of justifying our inequality and lack of justice by blaming people who suffer those inequalities and injustices. And the extraordinary thing about it is not simply that it exists, that this way of operating in the world, living in the world exists, is that it works so well, right? We've been doing this in this country since the beginning of this country. I mean, this country is founded on this kind of practice of blaming, of exploiting, stealing, robbing, murdering, raping, and then blaming it on the victims. That's largely the story of what America is. It can be more than that, and at certain moments, extraordinarily more. But for most of its history, it's been that. It's been the use of race categories to explain domination and exploitation.
Yeah, I mean that's really good, and of course there's so much to unpack with that as well. I remember reading Dr. King, and I was just looking it up as you were talking, and he cites George Kelsey, or Dr. George Kelsey, in his book Racism and the Christian Understanding of Man. And Martin Luther King, in citing him, states that racism is a faith, it's a form of idolatry. In its early modern beginnings, racism was a justificatory device. It did not emerge as a faith. It arose as an ideological justification for the constellations of political and economic power, which were expressed in colonialism and slavery. But gradually, the idea of the superior race was heightened and deepened in meaning and value, so that it pointed beyond the historical structures of relation in which it emerged to human existence itself. So what you're saying seems to be very much in line with kind of the vision of racism and race, and the understanding of racism and race that Dr. King prescribed to at the time. He even wrote that racism, which is the myth of inferior peoples, which then can lead to victim blaming, as you mentioned. I think that's extremely helpful. Isaiah, I'm wondering if you have anything you would like to chime in on.
Yeah, I think Tran, Jonathan also cites Dr. King quite a bit in his book too. I remember he relies on Martin Luther King Jr.'s concept of thignifying, right? So what American capitalism does is it thignifies people and everything, where it puts value on race. And he also talked about the three evils of that's pandemic in America, right? Which is greed, militarism, and racism. So I think these are profound traditions that we can rely on, and there's parallels to Jonathan's book that explores Martin Luther King's thinking. Jonathan, I want to ask you, kind of leaning into more of the political economic concept. What you're describing to me is kind of the age-old question, and repackaged in new and refreshing ways, of how we come to really characterize race as either an individual or structural things, right? And in the modern day concept, I think race in this obsession with identity can take that individualistic form, where it takes away attention from the broader political economic context. And I think that's what you're trying to describe. Can you unpackage for us a little bit more about why racial capitalism in the title? You talked about that a little bit, and what kind of profound things this tradition can offer us as Asian Americans, and also Christians at large, because I think that's a really important part of our discussion.
Yeah, I mean, Ray's nod to Reverend Dr. King is perfect, right? And you're unpacking it for us, right? So King started out, of course, thinking about race in terms of political economy. He was thinking about things like how racism was running rampant through the South, dominating the South, and it's expression was in things like bus systems, access to education. It was always about structures, and knew that race enabled a capitalist domination, and capitalist domination needed race. And so it's not surprising that in his biography, especially as he approaches what he's murdered, is the questioning of not simply the racial reality, but as you say, the imperial reality, and the way that this is all built up into a massive system of trying to keep poor people poor, right? At the end, he was moving towards a march for the poor. He wanted the poor to descend on DC, and he knew that in organizing the poor, he would be organizing across color lines, across issues of race, because he knew that the domination of the poor is something that is, in some sense, universal. And so thingification is just his sense that what we do as a people in the modern era, and this I think is just a Christian picture of sin and evil, is that we look at the world, and when instead of saying something like, how does that reflect God? Or how can I honor that, or get to know that, or that person, or that community? Instead of honoring things, we say, how can I make money off that thing? How can I eat it? How can I dominate it? How can I make it mine and not share it with anyone else? That's thingification. So the analogy that King made between, say, the domination of Black folks, brown folks, yellow folks in foreign lands, right? He saw this as continuous across a system of oppression. And we can draw similar analogies. This is what we continue to do to the earth, rather than imagining the earth as God's good creature, there to bring honor to God. And we honor God by treating it as such. We keep on saying about the earth, how can we strip it for more stuff? How can we use it and drain it until it's exhausted of every possibility other than what we want to make use of it as owners, making it property or labor, right? These are things we continuously do. Scripture just describes this is the fallout of once you're in the garden and God says, look how beautiful this is. I've made all of this so that you have enough, and that in having enough, you worship and have right relationship with one another and me. And once we said to God, I don't think that's enough, right? That's what Satan was whispering in our ear. It's not enough. Then we start to look at the world as a bunch of things that we need to collect, and the powerful have just greater abilities to collect it. And then they not only do that, but then they start oppressing other people so that they can collect more stuff, right? That's why Jesus in the Gospels is entirely questioning whether the orders around money might not be the worst possible things our souls can run up against, right? I mean, the thing that Jesus talks about most, of course, is himself and the kingdom of God, that is God. The thing he talks about second most is money and just how dangerous it is. I think he was anticipating that we would commit idols like this. We would worship mammon, and then we would need reasons to excuse ourselves. And that's what race language, I think, is. It's always been that. The question to me is whether it can be anything else other than what it's always been.
So that's very overwhelming, right? I mean, because you're right in that, there was a clear condemnation of mammon and the worship of money. But it's become so normalized that it's hard to see because we're swimming in it. Are you able to translate some of that into like the everyday? How do we do that on a day-to-day basis? And how do we participate in that, both as Asian American Christians, as well as kind of broader Christians in a broader sense? Yeah,
this to me, sorry for the metaphor here, but it's the $1 million question, right? So if we can come to terms with the way that our political economic world works, and by political economy, it sounds like I'm saying something super nerdy. I mean, I guess I am, but political economy is just a way of saying the way our society is organized, right? Everything from its economic structures to our politics, to the way we relate to other human beings, our culture, our language, our concepts, our habits, right? It's a total picture of how society is organized. So let's say let's say someone comes to terms with the racialized nature of our society, as my book and many other, you mentioned Dean Jennings' book, The Brilliant, The Christian Imagination. That's another attempt to come to terms with our world, the world in which we find ourselves. And so let's say you see that, and saying that, which also means you see your role in it. That means when you go buy stuff, when you own certain kinds of property, when you participate in certain kinds of markets, you're contributing, you're benefiting from these systems. It's unavoidable, right? If we've learned anything from our turn to the environment, it's unavoidable to recognize how implicated we are, right? The only way you don't know this at this point is just willful ignorance, right? You intentionally don't want to know, right? So the anti-CRT, the demonization of CRT, is driven mostly by, I don't want to know the truth about my own life. I'd rather live in self-denial because at least then I can be comfortable with myself, right? So let's say there's some of us or some part of us that wants to know. And so let's say you find out. That's your question, Ray. It's like, what do you do? Well, I think Jesus told us long ago what to do, right? He gave us a form of life called Christian discipleship, which is about dispossessing, not because Jesus wanted us to be unhappy, sullen people, but because Jesus wanted the very best possible life for us. When I raised my kids in a life of sacrifice, like I have these friends, they're doing these amazing things in Indonesia. They upped their life in America and they went to Indonesia. And of course, their children are having a difficult time. And we were talking about this the other day. And I was thinking at some point, they're going to say to you, when you took us and you put us in Indonesia to serve really poor people, really needy folks, to try to help them have better lives. That was really hard for me. But you also gave me the best possible life I could have, because what you gave me is Jesus. You said Jesus is better than what the world has to offer. And so your question's the $1 million question, because it's a really hard question. We're implicated, but we also have the ability to dispossess of ourselves of these advantages in the way that the economy dominates us by helping us dominate other people, right? And so what we can do, what Jesus always gives us a way out. What's the way out? Dispossession, right? What crucifixion and resurrection name for Christians is that we are never boxed in, right? The story that we participate, which is in the story of God's redemption of all things, God's liberation, that means losing in the terms of this world means gaining Christ. Paul was very clear about this language. And so it's hard. My guess is the reason that your question is such a great question is my guess is that most Christians actually know the answer. They just don't like it. It's not that difficult of a theological question, which is, what do we do in the face of evil? What do we do in the face of inequality? What do we do in the face of oppression? We give our lives to those who are oppressed because God is on the side of the oppressed. God is doing something. And in doing that, we don't do it to empty ourselves of happiness. We actually think that's the greatest way we can experience joy.
That's really good. And leaning into that a little bit more, as I was reading the initial drafts of your book, what really stood out to me was this relationship with Christianity and the political economy. Because as a lay reader, even though as I went to seminary, that relationship was never really profoundly engaged or unraveled, because Christianity was always kind of packaged into this individualized term, right? Where it's about just me and Jesus, where I wake up in the morning and do my devotionals and go to church, and that's kind of that happy-go, like suburban Christianity picture. But I think your book really was a paradigm shift, and it will be for a lot of people, in demonstrating Christianity and the gospel's profound engagement with the political economy and how sin has disordered that. And through Jesus as a king, who's a cosmic king, reorders that, we're able to participate in that. And the church is able to provide a profound source of alternative political economy against the disordered economy of this world, right? And so I think that participation was really key, and I think it's really important for our audience to know. But I want to ask
I just wanted to say something, right? Jesus wasn't killed for doing a lot of quiet times or having a super pious religious life. He was killed because he challenged a political economic order that was interwoven with religious commitments, right? And so, I earlier you asked, how is it that most of us think about racism? And it's interesting to ask, how do most of us tend to think about racism? And then how does it bank on kinds of certain conceptions of Christian life? So most people think this is what racism is. Racism is, I have bad ideas, mostly built on ignorance or prejudice of other people of color, right? And so I have prejudice to say against Black folks, or Black folks have prejudice against Asian Americans, and it's built on ignorance. And sometimes those prejudices or poorly held beliefs rise to the level of institutions, right? So the prejudice then gets institutionalized as institutionalized racism. I actually think that has it backwards. Racism always begins as a structure and a system that then produces racist attitudes and behaviors by individuals. So it's not as easy as getting better thoughts, reading more books, becoming less ignorant. It's about the structures and systems of our society. And any attempt of anti-racism to change hearts and minds without addressing structures and systems is absolutely doomed to fail. That's what we haven't quite gotten around in our heads. So for Christians, then, it's not a matter of having better attitudes. It's about looking at the world and seeing how distorted and broken it is, but yet how God is still in it, and pushing towards the way God is still in it, right? So here's a good example. As you both know, the book is two large case studies. The first is about a bunch of Chinese Americans who settled in the South during the Reconstruction period. Largely they're brought there because in the same way a lot of Chinese came in the 19th century as labor, as very, very, very cheap, exploitable labor. Well, the Southern plantation owners had just been forcibly required to give up their slaves, but they still wanted their cotton because they still wanted their money. And they're still trying to find ways to justify it with their Christianity. So they brought in a bunch of Chinese, and they're basically hoping to make them new indentured laborers. Well, the Chinese refused those terms and they stayed in the South. And over the next 100 years, you have on the one hand this amazing picture of Chinese who are not able to live either on the white side of town or really on the black side of town. So they literally lived like in the middle. And again, on the one hand, it's this amazing story of courage and resilience on the part of our Chinese American brothers and sisters. On the other side, right, they leaned into a political economy that had created food deserts in this part of the South. In other words, there are no grocery stores for poor Black folks because white people had no interest in giving groceries to Black people who were their former slaves. So there's these food deserts, and the Chinese folks created these stores, which on the one hand brought services and goods to Black folks. On the other hand, allowed them oftentimes to make money hand over fist. To me, that's a much more powerful and accurate picture of how racism usually unfolds in our country. It's not driven by bad attitudes, animus. I really don't like Black people. This idiosyncrasy, this kind of hyperbolic picture of the white Klansman, right? Or the sheriff with the attack dogs, or the redlining mortgage worker, right? Driven by bad intentions, racist hatred, right? Hatred in the heart. I'm thinking racism usually occurs by us leaning into systems that we exploit for our benefit, all the while probably even having progressive attitudes towards people of color, right? That's what's much more difficult. Of course, we should get rid of Klansmen and the red-faced sheriff with the attack dog. What's much more difficult is we have an entire system where simply by leaning into it, simply as a default position, I'm a beneficiary of that. And with the story of these Chinese Americans, that's what they became. They became simultaneously the most wealthy Chinese Americans in our country, and incidentally the most Christian, because they all adopted local Southern Baptist religion. And what did the Southern Baptist religion do? Well, it didn't make them more racist. It wasn't like the Southern Baptist Church was preaching racism, all the time. It was just implicitly doing it by saying something like, well, the world in which we find ourselves, it's fine. And it's fine that you all make money off of it. My guess is that's actually how racism usually works. It's not the hyperbolic image. It's the way the structures and systems and how some of us take advantage of it. Well, I know I do.
A lot to unpack there again, Jonathan. I think it is so helpful to relate again the broader political economic questions to Asian American identity and Asian American stories, because a lot of times we talk about cultural identity, and there's a place for that, but there is a broader story that all shaped our migration patterns, whether it's the racial capitalist wars in Vietnam or even what happened in Korea. That often gets, I think, dismissed or undergone in many of these public discourses. And of course, scholars have written about it, and activists have written about it and talked about it for a while. But when I read Asian American history, it's inclusion and exclusion is primarily along labor lines and economic utility. So I think it would be helpful as readers read your book to really explore that dimension of Asian American life. As we wrap up here, I just want to ask one more question. I think your book is really unique in the sense that it puts religion and Christianity at a center of analysis in this race discourse. And I think that is a pretty courageous thing, but also a lot of people are gonna read that with suspicion, right? Because Christianity has been so implicated in this racialized process that realizing Willie Jennings' thought is internal to the architecture of the Christian imagination. Racism is, right? So what do you say to those people who say, look, Christianity has been in the forefront of exploiting and creating these racialized inequalities across the world? Why Christianity then? It is a paradoxical and a contradictory question. So I wanted to ask that to you, Jonathan, as we wrap up this session. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I would say to them, if people were to say, why do you have any hope in the church? I would say, I'm not quite sure. It's probably an act of faith more than anything, because they're entirely right. I mean, there's a kind of unholy trinity in this country, and it's white people, Christianity, and racism, right? And so much of Christianity in America obtains through that unholy trinity. But at the same time, God has not abandoned Christianity in America. We know this because the most powerful form of Christianity in America is the extraordinary history of the Black church. There's other forms, right? The nonviolence movement within Mennonite communities would be another one. But these are indications that God has not abandoned us. I also feel like when I meet a lot of evangelicals, I mean, evangelicals, of course, these days are on, getting poo-pooed on for a lot of good reasons. But I meet a lot of evangelicals, white Christian kids, maybe in their idealism, but they give me hope because they're willing to come to terms with their participation, their complicity. And they're willing to ask, well, God saved me. And since I can dispossess everything and still be okay, what can I do? So, I was raised, as I said earlier, I was raised outside of Christianity. My default position is always unbelief. But when I meet Christians like this, right, in the second half of the book, I tell the story of a church in San Francisco that by invitation of the Black church in the Bayview Hunters Point part of San Francisco, the most marginalized part of the city, a part of the city that has undergone extraordinary forms of decades-long environmental racism against the Black community in what's often called Black San Francisco. This church has kind of taken up partnership in this part of the city. And what they've done is they live with their neighbors. They come to know their neighbors and love their neighbors and the concerns of their neighbors. Again, all in partnership with and mentorship by the local Black church community. They discover that there's no access to education, that the system is so broken. They also learn that there are tons of Asian Americans taking advantage of this in forms of opportunity hoarding, which this goes on all over the country as they try to get a leg up for their own kids. And so what this church did is, they happened to be a bunch of electrical engineers from nearby Stanford University, Berkeley, UCLA, what have you. They started a software company by which they generate income, and then they figure out ways to redistribute that money in the local community. Some of the ways is microloan processes, because local financing is better than the corporatized forms of financing. They created a local school so that kids in the community, which include Black kids, brown kids, migrant Asian families can have access to education, very high quality education. So these people help me believe in God. They're the minimal indication in our world that God has not abandoned us, even though we've given God every reason to abandon us. That's my hope. That's really why I wrote this book. I wanted to describe the world in which we find ourselves, at least as I understood it in my limitations and flaws. I wanted to describe that world, and what I wanted to try to give witness to what I think God is doing in that world. Because this world doesn't belong to racial capitalism. It doesn't belong to white racists, and it doesn't belong to all of us beneficiaries. This world is God's world, and God will never give it up. God will do everything God needs to do to redeem and reconcile it. And what this Redeemer Church is doing, like a lot of communities in our country, and have been doing since the beginning of this country, they're giving a different story. And the book is the attempt to call Christians to lean into that story, because that story isn't something like, let's start a revolution and call me when the revolution has started. That story is 2,000 years old, right? Friday, a Saturday, and Sunday, when Christ was crucified, buried, and resurrected. That's the original revolution. We simply need to lean into it.
That is powerful, and it was what a phenomenal explanation of the gospel and the radical call for Christians to faithfully obey. Halfway through the conversation we were having, I was like, Jonathan's preaching right now. He should keep preaching. So I appreciate you bringing a word, and I do hope that, you know, if you kind of stuck with us in this conversation, you might kind of have to rewind a couple of times to listen again to a couple of things that were shared. But also, I would encourage you to pick up the book. You know, we're at AACC. We're trying to kind of highlight more of the contributions of Asian American Christian thinkers and leaders and pastors, and we're really excited that that we're able to kind of highlight this seminal book, and we hope that it will be a resource for many churches to utilize. Actually, I will end with that final question. First of all, if they want to kind of get in touch with you or track with you on social media, you know, all of us are on Twitter, all of us, I don't know if Jonathan, you're on Instagram, but how can they get in touch with you? How can they tweet at you? And then secondly, how do you hope that this will be a resource for the church? And then we'll close with that.
Yeah, and I do want to remember to say give witness to what the collaborative has been doing over the last year, especially during this awful wave of anti-Asian American violence, and what the collaborative has done in terms of gathering Christians from across the country. Your role and leadership in this, Ray, needs to be commended and lifted up and amplified, because part of what you do is lift up and amplify the voices of so many folks who are marginalized by these realities. So I just want to commend the witness of what you're doing and the honor of being on this show. So and you know what young scholars like Isaiah are doing. I mean, these are the folks I mean that are giving me hope. The old people, the old people who need hope. In the Book of Acts, you know, in your old days, old people, you'll receive dreams, and young people will be the ones that give it to you. And Isaiah is the bearer of dreams. So they can get the book through. I actually haven't physically received a copy of the book, though a lot of people in the world have it, because Amazon is ahead, like always. Amazon is ahead of everything when it comes to the political economy. They're ahead of the publisher, Oxford University Press. So I actually don't have a copy, but if you go on social media, you see copies of it everywhere. I wish I was one of those people that had it. I'm also on Twitter and Facebook. Twitter's cat Jonathan Tran. You know, when I first wrote the book and people began to realize what I was trying to do in it, they said, you know, Tran, this is an amazing thing. No one's going to know what you're talking about, or no one's going to know anything about it because you're not on social media. I've purposely resisted social media for 20 years, or at least 17 years since Facebook. And so I literally got on 2 or 3 weeks ago at the imploring of people like you two, who said, hey, if you want to start a different conversation, you're probably going to need to be part of it. So quit hiding behind your own embarrassments of your own limitations. And put yourself in the world. So I'm on social media, and it's actually been pretty delightful, because what I found is a lot of people have been having this conversation long before I came onto the scene. So I'm really grateful for that.
Yeah. Isaiah, how do they follow you? How do they find you?
Oh yeah, I'm at University of Illinois Chicago, so you can just look on my profile, and I am on Twitter, Isaiah G Jeong, and yeah, that's where you can contact Ray, and just me directly.
Yeah. Well, again, thank you both for this wonderful discussion. I really do hope that this will resonate. This will land in the hands of people who have been looking for a work like this that allows their kind of experiences as Asian Americans and their faith to converge and to provide a vision for what might be. And so, if you haven't picked up the book, or if you're interested in picking up the book, please do so. Go on to Amazon and participate in the massive economic force that they are, or go to Oxford directly and purchase the book. Again, my name is Ray.
Ask local library or your bookstores to purchase it.
Yes, ask the local library to buy it. That's right, your local bookstores. Well, my name is Ray Chang, or Raymond Chang. I'm the president of the Asian American Christian Collaborative, and we're so glad that you tuned in. Thanks so much. Have a great day.